that episode was just really funny because it was
Oh,
so
yeah.
ridiculous. At the end of it, he's like crushing the cat's head in his bare hands, and the eyeball pops out, and like he's running around the house like with a Mjolnir, like smashing the
it's
walls.
so good, dude.
And, like, it's
Welcome to another episode of Nerd Legion with myself, Monte Cristo, and Doa. We are straying from our typical MO this week of sci-fi and fantasy TV and film / superhero. I guess that all gets lumped together.
Is superhero stuff fantasy or sci-fi though?
I guess it depends on whether it's in the future or not. It's kind of both. But
a little bit of both.
We are going to be still doing something supernatural for Halloween week, which is the fall of the House of Usher, the new show on Netflix by Mike Flanagan. I know, Doa, we were talking a little bit before this, and you have strong negative opinions.
I didn't hate all of it, but I mean, I need to preface everything I say in this episode with I'm not a horror fan. It's not that I'm like averse to like gore and death and things like that. It's just I just find it so hard to be engaged by anything horror related because I just don't get scared. It all just comes off seeming kind of cheesy and lame. I want it's so hard for me to find something that legitimately scares me or makes me uncomfortable. This show didn't do either of those things. And so I it's not my genre to start off with. It didn't do the few limited things I really want in the genre. And yeah, I don't know. I'm just not a big horror fan. So that will color my opinion. That said, there were some things I really liked about it. But for the most part, like, yeah, I was just kind of, I made it through. I pushed through to the end for you, Monty. And the thing is, it's fair. It's fair though, because you've had to watch a lot of Star Wars to get to where we're at in our podcast life. You had to watch all of Secret Invasion, which we thought might end up being good, but it was terrible. So you've paid your dues as well, and so it's time for me to step outside of my comfort zone, if you will. For sure.
So I'm not a big horror fan either, but I do like Mike Flanagan, and I did really like The Haunting of Hill House. And I agree with you that The Fall of the House of Usher isn't particularly scary, but it's also not. Look, I don't find Poe particularly scary. I find him like
really.
Kind of pulpy and silly and fun for the most part, and a little bit like delightfully gruesome. So I found that it was keeping in tone with the way that Edgar Allan Poe's short stories resonate with me. I'm also not the biggest Edgar Allan Poe fan, especially his poetry, which I think his poetry comes off really badly in this series. As for the horror thing, I'm definitely like in the same boat with you, where horror oftentimes does seem like comical or cheesy. It's supposed to a lot of the time. And I think there has been some modern horror. Like, I thought The Haunting of Hill House was like actually genuinely quite scary. But it's very, very
need to watch that.
Yeah, it's very, very different than this show. And I think that Ari Aster has done an amazing job of making some great suspenseful psychological horror with Hereditary and Midsummer. And I've really enjoyed Ari Aster's work as well. So there has been some horror that I have really enjoyed recently, but it's not like I'm a huge fan. And to describe what this show is The Fall of the House of Usher. Obviously, it's based off of a Poe short story, but the concept of the show is that it is kind of an overly obvious discussion of the Sackler family from Purdue Pharma and the opioid epidemic that is currently ongoing. And so instead of the Sackler family, it's the Usher family. And it's not just the Fall of the House of Usher, the Poe short story. They actually they jam a ton of Poe short stories, modern equivalents, modern twists on them, kind of episode by episode into this show. Some of the arcs of the story span the whole show, like The Cask of Amontillado, which is my favorite Poe short story. But there's also not limited, references to The Pit and the Pendulum, The Black Cat, Goldbug, Mask of the Red Death, tons and tons of this stuff. The Telltale Heart, of course, which I thought was actually done very well. So
they did put a lot of Poe in there.
Yeah, they did put a lot of Poe in there, which I thought was really fun. So it's kind of like an anthology of modern tellings of Poe stories within the context of the Usher family and all of the children of the patriarch of the Usher family dying one by one. So it's about the father, Roderick Usher, and his 6 kids who all die within a span of 2 weeks in very gruesome ways, which is quite fun, honestly. Like, it is quite fun.
To be fair, a lot of the show is supposed to be like a very like black comedy show. It's supposed to be like, that
absolutely.
It's a lot of it is intended to be humorous, and I think they succeed in some situations. Like what was it, the Black Cat?
Yes.
That episode I think was probably the funniest of the series, and there was a good amount of funny moments in it. So, like my view on it all is very kind of blasé, but I did like the way they did some things, which I'm sure we're gonna get into. I also have to say this is a pretty appropriate transition, actually. I know you said we're kind of going out of our realm a little bit, but we went from a Star Wars show to a show that stars Mark Hamill. So, there's a very strong Star Wars connection.
Mark Hamill was
here
great in this, by the way.
He was the best part of the show. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a Star Wars fan.
No,
yeah, he was awesome.
He is hamming it up so hard in this show as this kind of thuggish fix-it lawyer, Pym, for the Usher family. But he's just hilarious to watch. You can tell he's having such a good time with this part. It really makes the most out of his voice acting capabilities because he speaks in this very like clipped, low, gravelly voice, and you can tell he's kind of this very brilliant attorney who does all the dirty work for the Usher family, and he pulls off the role really well. I mean, most of the acting in the show is really good, actually.
You'll conclude your business here by 7. Mr. Usher welcomes you into his daughter's home, but his patience isn't endless. Stay out of the other rooms.
And he kind of stayed away from on-screen acting for a while after Star Wars. He moved mostly to voice acting. He's said in interviews that he preferred that for a long time. But I'm glad we're getting to see a little bit more Mark Hamill on camera. Obviously, I think that the new sort of Mark Hamill era began with the Star Wars sequels. And I'm glad it didn't end there, because obviously those weren't the greatest movies of all time, to say the least. But I'm glad we're getting to see him sort of like flex his on-camera acting muscles a little bit, and now incorporate all the things he's all mastered as a voice actor as well, like you're saying. So, because he's great, yeah, he's a ton of fun in this show. His character is really interesting. He's got this very mysterious, sinister past, and he just seems to he's the one person in the show that just seems totally unfazed by nearly everything. He basically, not to spoil too much, but he basically has to meet, death herself, or Satan, or whatever. I think it's supposed to be death mostly. And that's the only thing that really maybe shakes him a little bit. But even then, he's just like, I'm just living my life. I'm happy with that. Goodbye. So it's, so his character's great all the way through. So I'm sure we'll get into more of that. But where should we just start with the first episode and kind of just go through? We've got to be quick a little bit.
Well,
because we usually do. Yeah,
we can't go episode by episode, but I do think it's important to discuss. I think we can kick off the conversation with discussing what's really successful about this show and what struggles. Because for me, the black comedy bits that you mentioned earlier are by far the most successful parts of this show. I think when it is doing the pulpy thing of showing you these gruesome ways these deeply unlikable characters are going to die, because it functions kind of like Succession. It's how I wish Succession actually was, which is just murdering all of the horrible people within it. And I think
it's kind of like the general revenge against rich people porn.
Which is great.
It resonates with a lot of people, I'm sure, in our American society right now, that see all the CEOs making millions while there's layoffs and low pay and all that, and big pharma is a big part of that anger. So to a certain extent, I think this is meant to be sort of cathartic for that type of person that's really upset with all that stuff. It's extremely preachy at times, and I'm not just talking about when the priest is preaching, but especially at the end. It's like, oh my gosh, we get it. All right. Like,
Yeah.
geez, like
So
you know,
we'll talk
give me your
about the
manifesto.
flaws. Yeah, because the
Okay.
manifesto there is really horrible. And that
Yeah.
is definitely the worst part of this show, and it does end on a downer because
It's like way to suck the fun out of it.
as we've
Yeah.
discussed many times on this show, one of the problems with modern media is they literally have to spell it out for you. It's not,
Yeah.
and the show is already very obvious on its face because we just had the whole reveal of the Sackler family, and we know, the extent of the ongoing opioid epidemic and how horrible it's been. So anybody who is American is going to understand very easily the concepts that are presented within this show. And I think the timing, honestly, with the end of Succession, which is also about kind of a billionaire family and their divorce from reality, is on people's minds as well. So this is this plays into that show in many ways. And I think where I was saying this is very successful is that the characters are all very unlikable for different reasons. And
Sure.
they do a really good job of showing the effect that generational gigantic wealth really fucks people up and makes them arrogant or hedonistic or petty or uncaring about the lives of the normal people around them, especially when that wealth is built on lies and the suffering and death of hundreds of thousands of
A
people.
literal pyramid of thousands of bodies, as we find out later.
Yeah, that was a little on the nose at the end, wasn't it? With the bodies all falling from the sky, so that Roderick
Let the
Usher
bodies
could look
hit
at
the floor.
them.
Yep.
But within this are some really great use of Poe stories, starting with the Mask of the Red Death, which really sets the tone for the entire series. And for those of you who don't know, the story of the Mask of the Red Death is that there is a plague outside, and this Prince Prospero, basically locks all the nobility inside in a party so that they can live out a hedonistic masquerade ball away from the plight of the commoners and the people who are dying from this horrible disease. So they're basically quarantining themselves in luxury, and a figure with a mask comes in and turns out to be the embodiment of the plague that is then unleashed within the sealed palace, and then everybody dies. And the way that they manifest this within the show is that Prospero, who's the youngest of the Usher family, is a ridiculous hedonist, and I do love some of the writing in this show where they called him Gucci Caligula, which I thought was just wonderful. It's just
there were some great lines in this show.
It's very well written. It's very well written. A lot of the dialogue is very funny and very clever.
And the last thing he fucking needs is Gucci Caligula handing over the keys to the store.
So
I did feel on the hedonism side, I felt like it was too pervasive. Like everybody was kind of that same character to a certain extent. It was like they said, "Give me Poe, but make it sexy." And it's like, okay, let's a couple characters, sure, we can kind of show the different vices, but it seemed like kind of everybody had that quality, which was a little bit much.
I just as a quick sidebar, I do think that is an effect of extreme wealth, which is that because you can have everything that you want, you have to you develop very unusual tastes in order to
fairly common,
feel something again, because you almost have to invent these hedonistic ideas to satisfy yourself when you have everything
there was
that
some
you want
inventive
already.
stuff going on.
Yeah. So I agree they did take it a little too far, but it was definitely part of the pulpiness of this. So
I just want to see more variation in the characters.
Sure.
I felt like everybody had that trait, and and for like half of the characters, that was their trait.
Yeah.
So,
so with this, the way they play the Mask of the Red Death is that he throws basically an underground rave in one of his family's old buildings that's full of toxic waste, and sprays everybody with the sprinklers, and they all melt in acid, and it's super gross and like very entertaining. So, he has his own masquerade ball where everybody dies. But I thought that was a really effective use of the story. And they did a lot of this, like the telltale heart with the pumping of like the heart mesh
Yeah.
and the ticking of that
they
was like
worked it in very well.
really well done for the Poe
Totally,
story.
yeah.
So all the ways they wove the Poe stories in, I thought was excellent. And as somebody who's read all these stories, it was really fun for me to see how they were applying them within this show.
Yeah, and I've read all that not recently. It's been a long time, but I remembered enough that you would see an episode and you would see how they're setting up the Poe part of it, and that part was fun. I'll give it that. That part was fun. The pit and the pendulum I thought was very satisfying and funny at the end how they incorporated that, and Mask of the Red Death was, it was kind of the most obvious one where it's like they're talking about these tanks on the roof and it's like, yeah, okay, they're filled with acid. And that one was one of my least favorite ones because it took such great steps of like bad decision on bad decision on bad decision to get there. I felt like getting to the other Poe or inspired deaths followed much more logical paths, where this one was just kind of like a lot of people had to do make very dumb decisions to get this to be possible. Like no one thought to check what was in these tanks. They just all assumed it was water. None of it leaked out when they were connecting all this stuff to clue them off.
Sure.
Like there was that one was a little bit too much. And I understand it's not supposed to be super realistic, but that felt like too big of a leap to me, and I was personally disappointed because Rave to me was screaming that Blade should come out and start killing people any second, and he didn't. Where was Wesley Snipes in this?
Yeah, that's true. I did. It was very reminiscent of the opening of Blade. I did think that at the time as well.
We did.
We
both do like Blade.
I will fight back a little bit on the how was this possible at every step of the way, because we all know the overarching theme of this is that the Usher family basically made a deal with the devil, and so a bunch of supernatural things are happening, and they're all being orchestrated by Death to make these people die in horrible ways. So even though we don't see Death, the character who is Death, going through that, or Verna, which is an anagram of Raven in this show, even though we don't see her doing that, we see her doing enough other things that are similar, like telling the waitstaff to leave and manipulating people into specific situations, like causing them to do actions throughout the show, that it's like, everything was orchestrated by Death anyway. We know that. So it's not about how we got there. It's just about the flourish at the end.
What I learned is Death has a lot of time on her hands. I mean, or else she saves time to specifically deal, with this type of person, very effectively, very thoroughly, I suppose, which I could see, because Death in this seems more of a almost like a fair sort of force, because she kind of gives everybody an out.
Yes.
Before which I thought was a little bit odd, because she has to kill them anyway because of the deal. So what's the point of giving them an out? I guess maybe there's the argument, you could let them die with dignity, right?
Correct. Or not in a horribly painful way.
But it kind of seemed like she was kind of, enjoying all of it too. So it was interesting that she tried to give everyone an out before she went through with it, So
yeah, I think also one of the big questions of this show that is left completely unanswered as to why she even made this deal with the Usher family. Like there's no, it's problematic. I think that there's no motivation, because she clearly detests these people, right? She says like, it didn't have to be this way, implying that their actions and, level of free will made this a shitty outcome for the people in the way that they were dying. But she also made this deal very intentionally, and the deal she made, spoilers, at the end of the show, that's revealed, is that she made a deal with Roderick and Madeline Usher in order to make them immune from the consequences of the law. And the price is that when Roderick Usher was going to die, his entire bloodline would die with him. And perhaps this is a game that she plays to see what will happen. I mean, she seems to be omniscient, so not very fun game when you know the future. But
I have a lot to say about that moment, but go ahead and finish first.
Yeah, so I think in this show, it's just a little unclear what her motivation is, unless it's to see what people do with these powers, right?
So what you just said, I think, is the biggest problem I have with this show, because because there's such a huge inconsistency with how death operates. I'm trying to figure out in their fantasy universe where on one hand she says she wants to see what people are going to do, but on the other hand she seems to know what everybody's possible lifetimes would
Yes.
be. So which is it? We it seems like she kind of, how we can't have both, she can't be going around and telling everyone, oh, you would have been a doctor, you would have done this, or hey, you're gonna die, but don't worry, your mom is gonna go on to save lots of lives and do all this kind of stuff, and then be like, I'm making this deal because I just want to see what you're gonna do. Do you know what people are gonna do, or do you not know? I that inconsistency with your main antagonist, if you will,
Yeah.
really bothered me throughout. I was like, just pick one. You've made such a great inconsistency in your main antagonist and story plot pusher that it's hard to kind of
Yeah,
get into it.
there was also just a lot of unresolved points with death. So, for example, when they show the photographs of her with the Rockefellers
Those
and
are so funny.
and like the
Poor Mark
Carnegies,
Zuckerberg. Hold on a
Mark
second. Poor Mark
Zuckerberg.
Zuckerberg. Like they're showing all these rich people death throughout history, and they throw like Mark Zuckerberg in death,
And the
like
Cokes
walking
in
along having
there.
a good time. Yeah, but like imagine being Mark Zuckerberg and being like this college student who is like, I'm gonna make a website that's gonna bring people together. People can just kind of share their day. It'll be a cool way for friends to reconnect and all that. Not knowing that 20 years in the future or whatever, he would be portrayed as like one of the most evil people on earth, hanging out
cahoots
with death
death.
herself in a Netflix show. Yeah, like what? That's a story arc, isn't it?
Yeah, I think
Wow.
I think it was like a little funny, especially. But my point about this
It
is
was.
like, not only was it silly and photoshopped, but it also just didn't resolve any questions. Like, are we supposed to believe that all of these people made deals with the devil? Like, the only way to
What
get
deal did Mark Zuckerberg make?
the only way to get money and corporate power is to make a deal with the devil. I mean, it could be saying that, right? That seems,
I guess.
but it seems a little shallow
Metaphorically?
and one dimensional. And I think that leads us into our point about this show, which is that at its best, it is like having fun with these Poe stories. So what I love is great acting across the board. At its best, it's having
Totally agree.
fun. It's having a ton of fun with these Poe stories. It's really creative, modern retellings. It's great to see Poe used in these ways, and the way that they slip in the ticking of the telltale heart and how that's causing her to go crazy after she like kills her girlfriend and installs the mesh. Like, that's just delightful, gruesome fun. And when it's being subtle about the capitalism, like, I want the characters to show the effects of this massive amount of wealth by being shitty people and then dying in horrible ways. That's what I want from this show. What I don't want from this show is all of the preachy garbage that happens kind of throughout, but especially, to your point, Doa, at the end, where they just explain everything at point blank in the most shallow, one-dimensional method possible. And that
what it
is
reminded me of?
really awful.
It reminded me of the other famous horror film, Birdemic, Shock and Terror, because throughout, especially the last half of it, there's a lot of like very ham-fisted, preachy environmentalist messages. You've got this like guy on a bridge they meet randomly that's talking about global warming. They meet the hippie in the woods who's mad about spruce bark beetles not dying off during the winter, and then he hears a mountain lion and has to run away. And like, but they was very preachy about that in a very ham-fisted way. And when I was watching this, I kept thinking back to Birdemic and being like, did they collaborate with James Nguyen on on writing this? Like, it's so kind of out of nowhere too, because it's like we're having fun, like you said, with all this Poe stuff, and then suddenly we've got this very heavy-handed message about, oh well, I guess we could be like buying a bunch of social problems or programs instead of giving people pills and things. It's like, yeah, we all know we live in that world. We're trying to watch this to have fun. What are you doing? Come on, Dad.
And also
cheer up.
we also get the message. Like, the message is incredibly obvious because it is dealing with prominent contemporary events. Right?
I mean, it's there by context. They wouldn't have even need to really say anything.
Yes. So that's why I find this like somewhat disappointing, is that it's very uneven in its delivery. And But I do think that the dialogue is generally very well written. The monologues that people give, I think, are compelling a lot of the time. Beyond Mark Hamill, like, shout out to all of the actors. I know Mike Flanagan basically reuses a lot of the same cast members. Like, there are actors from Death is one of the main characters in The Haunting at Hill House. Carla Gugino, I think you pronounce her name. I thought Bruce Greenwood was insanely good as Roderick Usher. But all the acting across the board was excellent. I think that people really embodied the hamminess and cheesiness of some of these characters and kind of played them out very satisfyingly. I didn't think there was really a bad actor in the bunch or an unbelievable character. And on top of that, I thought the cinematography, which another thing Mike Flanagan is known for, was really gorgeous. Like, the set pieces were all super well designed. You know, they were using a lot of color themes for each individual character. So you saw like Tamerlane, like, everything about her was green. She was living in this beautiful green house. All of the sets and the different locations they used were because each of the characters has like a very different house and aesthetic style. So it was really unique to just visually watch each show as we got into each individual character's life. It was all really well shot and really well done. It's a very cool show to look at.
Yeah, I think it succeeded there too. It is interesting because it's the show. There are a lot of elements of this show I liked. I just thought overall it felt like a little bit of a slog to get through because those parts that I liked were so kind of sprinkled in with a lot of other, like we've already kind of described, heavy-handed, kind of plotting plot elements and things. So it is too bad because I feel like you could have maybe given him a couple less kids, cut a couple episodes, tighten things up a little bit, ditched the ham-fisted monologuing and made something a little bit better. But it was interesting. I did keep thinking about Griswold, the boss, the guy who ends up being the person walled up in Cask of Amontillado style.
Which is funny because Fortunato is the name of the company that they're running. The Ushers run, and Fortunato is the name of the guy who gets walled in as he's lured down to the basement to test the wine. There's a lot of really like fun references because as soon as I heard the company is called Fortunato, I was like, okay, well, how are we doing the Cask of Amontillado? And they eventually got to it. It took until the last episode, but
it was very satisfying when it happened too. But I kept thinking the whole time when I'm looking at like Michael Trucco, he looks like the sort of like if you tried to make a clone that was a combination of Paul Rudd and Christian Bale and like put them together and you would get Michael Trucco, if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm pretty sure. Because when I first saw him, I was like, is that Paul Rudd? And I'm like, no. Is that Christian Bale? And then I looked it up and I'm like, oh, it's him. But he kinda has the appearance with certain angles, certain lighting of both. Yeah,
that's true. I hadn't thought
very
about
interesting.
that.
Yeah, Hollywood is taking just like a genetic code from different top actors and creating new actors out of them. That's a preview of a line I'm going to say like 20 years from now, and we're still doing the show, and it's actually happening.
Or they just use AI to mix the characters together, right?
Oh, nevermore.
Yeah.
See, that was a throw into the final episode where the AI just kept saying nevermore. Yep.
Which
there you go.
That is one of the aspects of the show that I didn't like, which is as much as Poe's stories I think really work here, the interjection of Poe's poetry I found to be really like deeply jarring.
Yes.
And the reason is look, Poe is not a very good poet. Okay, he's not. And the thing about Poe's poetry is that it sounds really good, and what he but it's overly flowery because what he does when he writes is there's very little depth to the meaning of his poetry. It's not Shakespeare, right? And it has a lot of internal rhyme structure, so it sounds it flows out of the mouth very nicely, but it's really overwrought a lot of the time. And it just sounds awkward when you have modern cutting dialogue and you're tossing in this 19th century, like even by 19th century standards, like very, very ornate language. And it sounds really weird. And it got so bad, which I just started laughing at the end because the death character starts reciting this poem. It's City in the Sea, which is a
right.
famous Poe poem to Madeline, right? And she says that this is going to explain things to Madeline. And she recites this poem to Madeline, and Madeline's basically just sits there and says, what the fuck? How does that explain anyway? And anything. And Death's like, just sit there for a while and you'll get it. And that's it. That's the end of it. Which is, by the way, that poem means nothing, to be clear. There is no depth to that poem. I have known that poem for 20 years, and I don't understand what Death was trying to say in that scene to Madeline.
I mean, Death is kind of knows more than us. She thinks on a higher level than humanity. So who knows? Maybe you'll get it in another 20 years. But, Monty, you can't spell poetry without try. And they did try. It didn't work out very well, but they gave it a shot.
Yeah. So
I subverted your expectations. You thought I was going to say Poe. I took the other part of the word. So,
yeah. So I thought a lot of the inclusions of Poe's poetry was just, it kind of broke me out of the show. Like it caused my suspension of disbelief to be really disjointed, because it just felt super out of place. And I just don't think it was necessary. Like, I think you can make references to the poems without actually just literally reading entire poems within the show.
Another thing like what we're talking about, right? Where they do everything too literally now in shows, where it's like, we get it, it's Edgar Allan Poe. Like, it's not like they start reciting Poe stuff and you're like, oh, this is about Poe. Oh, I get it now. That's why there's the Mask of the Red Death reference. And like, the titles of the episode literally tell you what's going to happen in the episode. Like,
which
we don't
I like.
need it. It was,
which I like.
Yeah, I mean,
because
you knew you were in for.
I sit there and I'm like, I remember this story. How are they going to do it? And I get all excited, and then I enjoy the way that it plays out within the episode. I thought the most successful part of this is the use of Poe fiction. Like, I was not upset by the way they used any of the Poe stories.
I was disappointed with the payoff with the murders in the Rue Morgue part, because that, to me, it's always been kind of the scariest Poe like stuff, because, and the reason being is that the orangutan, who is the murderer in Murders in the Rue Morgue in that short story, isn't really even trying to kill people. It's just really strong and trying to mimic what it saw this barber do, but it just ends up chopping off this woman's head, like sawing it off, and then this other woman freaks out seeing it, so it freaks out and like strangles her and stuff. And it's like, that's scary, because you're dealing just with this like insane strong animal that like doesn't know what it's doing, but it's still got the ability to kill you easily. And to me, that was pretty disturbing when I read that in middle school or whenever it was that I first read that. And so to have it at the end be like, oh, well, I guess, Vera was a chimpanzee the whole time, and like, that's it. I'm like, oh, really? Like, I was hoping one of them would get out and there would be this kind of thing, and that would cause us embarrassment with, but maybe that was a little bit too sinister for the show. That would have gone into a little bit too dark for this, being that they were trying to keep it kind of pulpy and funny, but I was let down by that one.
I do think that I agree with what you're saying, but they also had to tie it into the broader narrative, and having the chimp hopped up on adrenaline ties into the Victorine heart mesh experiment, so it works better in the context of all the other narratives within the show. And also, Doa, how are they going?
The other ones.
It
was one that they just kind of used it to push forward the heart device plot,
yes,
instead of giving it its own real thing.
Yes, that's true. So it did fit into a more overarching narrative, and that's a decision that was made. But also, Doa, how were they going to ham-fistedly talk about animal experimentation for capitalist products if we didn't do it that way?
You keep doing that kind of thing, you're going to have a birdemic on your hands. You gotta watch out. You gotta be careful there.
They had to jam. You have to understand, Doa, it wasn't just enough to discuss the evils of the opioid epidemic. And I also just don't think they did a very good job of even exploring the possible upsides, because you did hear some of the characters say, oh, it's an end to pain and all of this other stuff,
Sure. Yeah.
The net negative of the opioid epidemic is now very obvious in the modern
I'd say so.
society. But I do think that they did give some justifications as to why they did this originally, even knowing that the substance was addictive. But it's not enough that we explore that topic, though. We now have to get into animal testing on products. And it felt like every other evil of capitalism also just had to be addressed in this show, which overstuffed it thematically in many ways.
Why was it the media mogul that had to pay for the animal testing sins? That was my question too. Is that like the what was her name? Camille, right? Why I was hoping for a more media related, death for her, like some crazy fan does her in or something, which is a whole commentary in itself, or something like that. Like there was so much they could have done with her character and that side of the evil of wealth, and that it's controlling our
The
media
PR.
to a big extent now. Yeah, exactly. So they kind of dropped the ball on the Murders of the Rue Morgue payoff, I think, and they dropped the ball on her character and addressing that type of thing, right? And they just threw in a random animal cruelty stuff. Like, again, we can see that animals are being cruelly treated, and that's a bad thing. You don't need to give us a big monologue, and so that was probably my least favorite episode, I think, because
That's
I
fair.
felt let down by the end of that character and the use of that Poe short story.
Yeah, that's fair. I like I said, I think the best done ones were kind of the Mask of the Red Death. Oh, the Black Cat was also really well done.
Yeah.
I did like the episode with Napoleon and his obsession with this black cat within the walls attacking him, because that one tied in. I thought that one worked really well with his drug addiction issues, and
Yeah, totally.
him seeing things and getting fucked with by death, and you at the end you don't know if it's the drugs or if it's death causing these hallucinations or some some combination of these two things. And I
it was
thought
just funny. Go ahead.
No, I just thought that was really well done as well.
That episode was just really funny because it was ridiculous. At the end of it, he's like crushing the cat's head in his bare hands and the eyeball pops out, and like he's running around the house like with a Mjolnir, like smashing the walls.
It's so good, dude.
It's
that's what I wanted from this
great.
show, though, because he's the video game designer, so he has the Avengers Thor hammer, all the nerd stuff, and he's just breaking apart and it's adequately gross, and it doesn't have to be more complicated than that, because the characters are the core interest of this show. Like the way that
totally.
each of them has been fucked up by by being a bastard, like being an illegitimate child, having all of these different mothers, all of their various vices, their attempt to have a relationship with their father that's twisted by their desire to get his money, right? Like that's what I want to see of this show, is the family dynamics and the way each of them has kind of been uniquely harmed by the situation that they're in, and the way that manifests. And that's what Mike Flanagan does really well, because that's what happened in The Haunting of Hill House. Is he is excellent at showing how events experienced by the same events experienced by family members causes them to be dysfunctional in different ways, which is what The Haunting of Hill House is about, right? How formative memories, in A Haunting of Hill House, it's obviously the
Don't spoil too much.
the experience of being in this house, because the kids were different ages and saw different things, spooky things, caused them to have very different issues later on in life and caused a very dysfunctional family environment. So this is like, I think, what Mike Flanagan does really well. So when we see the interactions between the children, like I loved the scene between like Camille and Napoleon about how they have to do the PR spin on Prospero's death, and how Napoleon's going to have to be the member of the family that goes out there, but he's an unreliable drug addict, will even show up to these interviews. Each one having to present their business ideas to Roderick Usher to get funding for them, and that's a rite of passage for every single member of this family. That's the stuff that is great about this show. And so when I just see the Black Cat stuff, that episode doesn't do anything that's super preachy, right? It's just about, it's a very good exploration of this character's faults and drug addiction and the way that it causes him to spiral into madness with the help of this death character. So in a nutshell, like, that one episode is really good, and it shows all the best aspects of this show because it is funny and silly and over the top gross and great.
I have to say that episode contains the scariest moment in the whole show for me, actually, which is when Leo makes scrambled eggs for his partner in that next morning, and they are just the most dry, like, chunky, gross scrambled eggs I've ever seen. Like, as someone who's put a lot of time into making good scrambled eggs, I can make very good scrambled eggs. I saw those and I was horrified. I was like, you are serving that to someone you care about? How dare you? I was terrified. I was horrified.
Well,
I was disgusted, and it'll take me a while to get over that one.
To be fair, his male partner, his boyfriend, was surprised that he made breakfast, implying that he doesn't do that, so he's probably not a good cook.
No excuse.
My takeaway,
Doa, use YouTube. Yeah, go ahead.
My takeaway, Doa, is that it looked like he had made like a dozen eggs. There were so many scrambled eggs. Did you notice that?
Right? Yeah. I mean, but again, like, he's out of it, right? So he's just cracking a ton of eggs in there and doing all. But man, that's no excuse in my book. You got to make some better scrambled eggs than that.
It was just a huge amount of eggs. I literally turned to my wife and I said, "How many eggs did he make? How is it possible to eat that many eggs?"
Gotta get that protein dose in the morning, it's big. But we, as another side note with this show too, we talked about the Star Wars connection with Mark Hamill, but are you aware about the Star Trek connection that we have in this show as well, in that Bruce Greenwood also played Captain Pike in the 2009 Star Trek movie when they rebooted Star Trek as well. Yeah. So welcome back. So this show is actually, it really is a crossover of a lot of our interests here in Nerd Legion. We got Star Trek, we got Star Wars, we got, some Marvel stuff with Mjolnir being used. So it really was all encompassing in that regard, I thought.
Yeah. So I overall enjoyed this show. I think I don't regret watching it. I think it's relatively easy for me to ignore a lot of the preachiness that occurred that caused this show to be thematically dragged down, because I think the highs of the acting and the dialogue and the character interaction and the Poe integration, because I enjoy literature and seeing it applied in new ways in modern contexts, made it so that I thought this was pretty good overall. Like,
it was a neat premise.
It was fun, And it was fun, and I think it's uneven, but the highs are really high, and the lows for me are just rather annoying and on the nose, and I don't like being preached to. But it wasn't enough. It comes in a couple minutes here and there, but it wasn't enough to really bring this show down. Is it significantly worse than The Haunting of Hill House? Yes, it is. That show, I think, is far better and far scarier. But like I said at the start, I don't think this show was designed to be scary, because I don't think Poe's work is particularly scary in the first place. I think it's more about making you unsettled and kind of exploring some macabre ideas rather than being terrifying.
Yeah. I mean, like I said earlier, I was never really unsettled by the show. It was campy, it was corny for me, and I liked when it was doing that. It's definitely not the worst show that we watched for Nerd Legion. It's far from the worst, I would say, but it's also kind of far from the best of what, we've talked about on this show. I think it is.
I think it is the best.
I would disagree.
What is the best? What is the best? What is the best?
What shows have we watched on this again? I'm trying to remember.
The bar was set very low, to be fair, but I do actually think this is the best thing that we've talked about.
I think the second half of Strange New Worlds season 2 was better. Can we only take half of this show?
No.
Okay, well, I'll get back to you on that one.
We're comparing 10 episodes of Strange New Worlds to 8 episodes of this show. This is a more even experience than because I mean, some of those, there was no episode of this show that was anywhere near as bad as some of those episodes of Strange New Worlds.
All right, I will reiterate what I admitted already at the beginning of this episode, where this show already came into it with a strike against it through no fault of its own. By I am not a huge horror fan. I never have been, so I've never really watched shows like this by choice. The other thing is I'm so tired, and we've talked about this in other episodes. I'm so tired of how ham-fisted and preachy shows are these days, and like. So whenever any show kind of strays in that territory, I'm like, really? Again? I was kind of enjoying this, and now this is happening, and I'm like, I get it. And like this show goes farther in that regard than a lot of the other ones we've watched. It goes to the extreme where they're having like Roderick Usher quoting Donald Trump at the end with the like, I can stand in Fifth Avenue and
That
shoot
was
anybody.
so terrible.
I'm like, we get it. All right, we get it. We've watched 8 episodes of this. Yes, we don't like evil rich people. Yes,
it also just undoes a lot of the really good shit that happens in this show, because one of, if not the very best moment of this show is the flashback to the late 70s and early 80s when Roderick betrays Dupin at the deposition. And it's that moment where you see the turn in his character and how he's willing to do absolutely anything to advance, even against, his very like good-hearted wife's wishes. And that should be enough. Like that moment where you have this excellent buildup. And the Dupin Roderick Usher arc is really good throughout the show. Their conversations in the old house, all that shit is so well done. And for them just to throw this Donald Trump shit in at the end is completely stupid and ridiculous.
Well, he's not a Donald Trump character. He's not this like a bombastic buffoon. He's very sort of cold and calculating, but he's also a loving family man, which is very different, obviously, than Trump, it would seem. So to have that quote just thrown in there, it's like, you see, he's like that other bad rich person, and you're like, yeah, I know the whole show's been about that, but like, so having him say that, he's not a Trump-like character, so it seemed out of character for him to say at the beginning with, and it was just another ham-fisted, be like, oh, you see, are you reminded of something in your world? Maybe you should think about, and like, okay, yeah, we know. So yeah, so it did that to such an extreme that it really turned me off from a lot of the show, and it made it hard to enjoy the parts of the show that were legitimately very good. So that, and I'm just not a big horror fan in general, made this a very mediocre to kind of trying experience to push through at times. Like, yeah, there were moments where I was watching the screen and I was having a great time, for sure. But I feel like there were less of those than moments where I'm like, all right, let's get on with it. We know what's going to happen here. We know it. We get your point, So for that, it was a very tepid experience for me.
I thought it was pretty good. And I think I'm glad I watched it in the end, because the good moments were good. The bad moments are forgettable, but I don't think that really the bad moments I can brush aside in my memory because I enjoyed the experience of watching all the really high moments, and I enjoy reflecting on this show and its use of material. It's not entirely successful. It's not Mike Flanagan's best work. But it had to play with rails to begin with because the concept of what they were doing hedges it in a way. And I do wish they hadn't actually used Poe's poetry in it because it's shitty and jarring, and it doesn't.
They didn't need to.
They didn't need to, and it doesn't.
No.
It doesn't add to the experience. It just shatters kind of the suspension of disbelief, and it doesn't really add anything to the show whatsoever. So I didn't like that, and I think it could have been much more. I wouldn't even say subtle. It's not a subtle show to begin with. But if you just eliminate some of the monologues about capitalism, it's still very on the nose. It still kind of browbeats you in a way, but it went over the top with how blunt it was and direct it was. And it just got fucking ridiculous at the end. I agree with you. It just got so ridiculous.
Just very ham-fisted, so that, they could have done all the same stuff and left out the monologues and left out and we still would have gotten the same exact message. We just would have gotten it in a much more engaging way, I think. But and then the third thing for me was the death character that was very compelling, having this very glaring inconsistency in how this fantasy character operates in their universe. And as a big fantasy fan, if you're going to create a fantasy universe, you can set whatever rules you want to for this universe. My only ask is that you stick to them. and it didn't seem like they were sticking to the rules or even.
I don't think they knew what the rules were. They didn't even establish it. That's the thing. That's
the thing. Yeah,
they drop these hints, such as the algorithm, the facial recognition, going through all those old pictures and finding all of these. And so I thought to myself, oh, they're going to go somewhere with this. Did it go anywhere? No. It was never explained. It didn't matter in the end whatsoever.
The message was other rich people are bad too.
They all make deals with the devil, Noah.
This is very much an eat the rich kind of movie where it's like the moral I got, the theme I got is that we should really dislike wealthy people because they're all terrible. That is the moral of this story from what I gathered from it.
You know what?
There's a lot of scummy rich people out there, but there's also a lot of altruistic ones too. So it was a bit too far on one side, I think.
I was also just disappointed, Doa, that they only took it as far as photographs. I was just waiting for them to like show a mosaic from Pompeii of her standing next to like a Roman senator, or
or like a statue of her,
like a statue, like
a Roman emperor or something,
next to an Egyptian pharaoh with some like hieroglyphics around it. That shit would have been actually hilarious.
Picture of her like peeking over the grassy knoll, in Dallas.
For me, I wanted them to show her in some Renaissance painting next to the Doge of Venice. Like, if you're gonna be ridiculous like this, get really fucking ridiculous. You know what I mean? Like, don't just show me pictures up until the early 20th century. Like, go back and show me some fucking oil paintings and some mosaics.
Look at that Caravaggio painting, but it's like her as Judith, cutting off the guy's head and all that. Yeah, she's having her arm around Hitler.
Yeah, exactly. She's just in Da Vinci's The Last Supper. I don't know.
That's right. Yeah, she's just like under the table.
And they didn't go bold enough. Why stop at rich people? If you really want to make commentary, show her just like chilling with Muhammad and Buddha and see how mad people get. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna get preachy, right? Also, speaking of preaching, the sermon that was being delivered in the funeral at the first episode, I was like, what is this guy even saying? It didn't make any sense.
Poem.
It was like, is it? Oh, okay. Because it
was very badly done.
I didn't realize this because I was like, this is like the worst sermon ever. It's like life is terrible and we're all gonna die and that's a good thing. And I'm like, wow, this priest is really good. He's hardcore. That's really laying on the guilt in this here.
I'm pretty sure. I'm not listening to it right now, but I'm pretty sure that's what was going on. I think that's what
maybe it was. And it's been a long time since I've read all that Poe stuff, and I didn't read all of his poetry, so I might have missed that one. But
you're not missing much by not reading his poetry. I'm going to be honest with you.
My point is that it didn't seem comforting for the surviving family at the time, which I would imagine, even if it is an Usher funeral, or Ursa, as Little John says, you would think it's supposed to be more comforting.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that'll do it for this week. Overall, I think this was the best thing we've watched on Nerd Legion. That's how bad what we've been watching has been, though. Although I will say, Loki's tracking in a very positive direction.
I agree. I'm having fun with Loki. Yeah.
And we are going to talk.
Low-key, I'm enjoying Loki.
Yeah. I think we are going to talk about the next 2 episodes of Loki this coming week for you guys. And I am hoping that it stays on track with the first 2 episodes that we saw, because if that level of quality is achieved throughout this season of Loki, it will in fact be the best thing that we've watched, better than this show. So I am encouraged. I am encouraged.
We need a montage here of Monty talking about being encouraged by the way a season is starting in shows, because I feel like we've gotten this like 3 or 4 times at this point, and it always ends in despair. So,
but Strange New World started really badly and got better.
Yeah, it does go in reverse sometimes. But it almost seems like seasons should start poorly and get better.
That's fair.
But
that's fair.
Yeah.
All right. We'll be back with you guys next week for another stab at Loki. Thanks.